Today, we're going to talk about a single law, just one piece of legislation from 1887. On paper, it was presented as a humanitarian reform, something to protect Native Americans. But in reality, it kicked off a chain of events that led to shattered sovereignty, cultural desperation, and ultimately, a horrific massacre. So let's unpack how this happened. And that's really the big, haunting question here, isn't it? How could a law with supposedly noble intentions lead to such a devastating outcome? To even begin to understand it, we have to go back to the American West in the late 19th century. All right, so picture this scene, the Great Plains. The great westward migration of American settlers is in full swing. And this is creating this intense, unavoidable pressure on native nations, a conflict over the one thing that defined both of their worlds, land. As more and more Americans moved west, that pressure just kept building, and white settlers started pushing a new story, a new narrative. They argued that native nations had way too much land and that they weren't using it efficiently, by settler standards. That their whole nomadic hunting lifestyle was inferior to American-style farming. The key thing to get here is that this wasn't just a land grab. It was a land grab that came with a powerful, built-in justification. So you've got this pressure cooker of competing interests, and right when it seems about to boil over, the U.S. government comes up with what it calls a final, humane solution to the so-called Indian problem, and that solution was the policy of allotment. And here it is. This is the key piece of the whole puzzle, the Dawes Act of 1887. The idea was simple, and in the minds of the people who created it, it was even progressive. It would break up the big, communally owned reservation land and give out individual plots to Native families. The goal was to force them to become settled farmers, just like their white neighbors. The ultimate aim? Total assimilation. And the process they set up was very methodical. First, they'd survey the communal land and just carve it up. Then, they'd assign plots based on family status. Tribal members got a 4-year window to choose their piece of land, but, and this is a huge but, if they resisted or just refused to choose, a federal agent would simply choose for them. There was no opting out of this. Now, that number, 160 acres, is incredibly revealing. It wasn't arbitrary at all. It was the exact amount a white settler could claim under the Homestead Act. This tells you everything you need to know. The entire model was designed to remake Native society in the image of the American homesteader, completely ignoring centuries of their own traditions. And here it is. This is the provision that would prove to be the most devastating of all. After every eligible Native person received their plot, all the so-called surplus land, and we're often talking about millions of acres, was taken by the federal government and sold off to American settlers. This was the engine for a massive transfer of land. The impact of this policy was immediate, and it was absolutely catastrophic. It went way beyond just the loss of land. It struck right at the very heart of Native identity and their ability to govern themselves.
I mean, the contrast here just couldn't be more stark. The act was sold to the American public as this uplifting, helpful reform. But the reality? It completely blew up traditional lifestyles, economies, and social structures, leaving entire nations powerless.
And this is a crucial point. The Dawes Act explicitly stated that tribal governments and their laws could just be dissolved and replaced by U.S. law. It was a direct assault on the whole concept of tribal sovereignty, basically an attempt to erase Native nations as political entities. Okay, so your land is disappearing, your entire way of life is under attack, a profound sense of desperation starts to take hold. And it's out of that desperation that a powerful spiritual movement rose up, one that offered a vision of hope. For the Lakota Sioux in particular, the situation was unbelievably dire. Their reservations were getting carved up by the Dawes Act. Starvation was becoming rampant, and it was made even worse by corrupt federal agents who were cutting the food rations they'd been guaranteed by treaty. Add a severe drought on top of all of that, and you have a people just staring into the abyss, terrified of a future as landless subjects in their own homeland. Into this desperate landscape came the prophecy of a Paiute holy man named Wovoka. And his vision was absolutely electrifying. He promised that if people lived righteously and danced the ghost dance, the world would be restored, their ancestors would return, the buffalo would come back, and the encroaching white settlers would just disappear. It was a message of miraculous renewal. This prophecy spread like wildfire across the West, but it found its most passionate believers among the Lakota, for whom that promise of restoration resonated so deeply because of their desperate circumstances. But here's the tragic turn. What was a message of hope for the Lakota was interpreted as a threat by American officials. This spiritual revival quickly led to a panic, which then led to a military crackdown and a tragic, violent end. This timeline shows you just how fast everything fell apart. In a matter of weeks, you have fearful reports from agents leading to the killing of the famed chief Sitting Bull. This causes panicked bands of Lakota to flee their reservations. On December 28th, one of these bands is intercepted and led to a creek called Wounded Knee. The very next morning, the U.S. cavalry moves in to disarm them, tensions flare, a shot is fired, and absolute chaos erupts.
And when the shooting stopped, somewhere between 150 and 300 Lakota people were dead. The American cavalry used heavy weaponry, firing indiscriminately right into the camp. It was a massacre of men, women, and children.
The shots fired at Wounded Knee echoed far beyond that cold December day. They marked a brutal end to an era and completely shaped the memory of the American West. Historically, this is the significance of Wounded Knee. It really represents the final, tragic end of the Indian Wars, the end of any large-scale armed resistance by Native nations on the Great Plains.
And this quote just highlights the profound disconnect in how this period was experienced. For the tribes of the West, it was an era of conquest, poverty, and loss that didn't just stop in 1890. But for many other Americans, this same dark period was romanticized into the myth of the Wild West, a heroic story of settlement and progress that conveniently ignored all the ongoing damage.
And that leaves us with the final, lingering question. The story of the Dawes Act is a story of, well, maybe good intentions, but a catastrophic failure to understand the culture, sovereignty, and basic humanity of the people it targeted. It forces us to ask, what happens when we create policies for other people without their voice? And what tragedies might we be setting in motion today?